So it's a great pleasure and honor to have Andrew Pickering here with us, and no need to be introduced. Andrew will answer a few questions that concern the very topic for which this collective has been organized, that is cybernetics and neo-cybernetics. So the first question is, I hear someone tapping on the keyboard. I don't know. Anyway, the first question is, I hope everyone's in fact, why cybernetics in these times of crisis? Why can we say that there is a revival of cybernetics in our times? Do you think that they can be connected to the fact that we are in a critical time of transition?
Okay, well, great to be here. Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me, Brunella. The original question on the poster was something about cybernetics and the ongoing global political and environmental crisis. So I was thinking about that, and my oh God. That's the telephone. try and ignore the telephone in the background.
It's difficult. It's a difficult question. Actually.
No, it's not the question. Perhaps you can't hear it, but the telephone is ringing and giving me messages. Okay. So my recent work has been about what we could call the global environmental crisis, the Anthropocene. And what I've been trying to do in this book, it just came out about two weeks ago, is contrast two ways of being and acting in the world. One of which isn't cybernetic, and the other one is. The non-cybernetic way of being in the environment is what Heidegger called enframing. Stance of mastery, domination, treating the world as standing reserve. That's our dominant way of going on. It's been very successful. All the power of modern technoscience stems from it. We live in a world that's been created by the stance of enframing. But the argument of the book is that the environmental crisis is a kind of dark side of enframing, a necessary dark side. That all of we build cars, nuclear power stations, dams, to dominate the world, and often these succeed, but every now and then they fail. Even when they succeed, there's a kind of spillover and excess. Things work as they're intended, but they generate unintended consequences, something like global warming as being kind of the unintended spin-off of burning fossil fuels and generating carbon dioxide. Would be an example. So the dark side of the Anthropocene, the extinctions of species and cultures, environmental disasters, global warming, all of these things are the dark side of our dominant way of acting in the world. So the question for me, which will get us to cybernetics, is could we think of a different pattern of being in the world? Could we act differently on the environment and nature? And the argument in my book is that we could. The trick is to find a different pattern of action that I call acting with the world, or poiesis, as Heidegger called it, which instead of mastery is interested in finding out, loosely what the world wants to do and tuning ourselves into it. This entails staging what I used to call dances of agency with the world, kind of performative back and forth. We do something, the world reacts, we react to that. There's a way of fitting ourselves into the environment. And this is obviously a kind of cybernetic process, in as much as it hinges on a feedback loop running through the human and the non-human, us and the environment, in one way or another. And my book is just works through several examples of what this can look like in practice. And the subtitle of the book was Floods. Well, it's changed now, but the original subtitle was Floods, Farming, Fires and Spirits, which gives you an idea of the kind of topics that are talked about in it. And I argue that this other way of going on, this cybernetic way of engaging with the world, nature, the environment, is interesting in itself as a kind of alternative to our dominant pattern of enframing the world. It brings us closer to nature in this performative back and forth, which is, I think, what we really need. And in one way or another, it avoids or addresses or ameliorates the problems and perils of the Anthropocene. So this is how I see cybernetics being able to contribute to addressing especially the environmental crisis of the Anthropocene. How's that? It's gone quiet in my attic now. Oh, Christ. I can't hear you.
My mic, now you can hear my voice. When you talk about the dance of agencies or mango, this sounds like a kind of mixing up of harmony and dissonance, because mango recalls noise, chaos. Do you think that cybernetics is a way to cope with chaos or noise in this mango of decisions? And how can this be an alternative to the control that the model of science has suggested? But when you say back and forth, going back and forth with nature, which is interesting, what do you think this can mean, let's say, cybernetically?
There's a kind of ontological picture here, which runs from my work on the mangle through the cybernetics book to the new book, and the ontological picture of what the world is like is a kind of Taoist one of endless, unpredictable, open-ended becoming of both the human and the non-human. And the idea is that we human beings are just part of the flux of becoming and caught up in it, just like everything else. And then, cybernetics, the very word, refers to kind of steersmanship. How do we steer ourselves in this unpredictable flow of becoming? The answer has to be a kind of performative experimentation, I think, trying this, trying that, trying something else. And I try to show in the cybernetic brain book that there is at least a very interesting line of development in the history of cybernetics, which has this kind of back and forth performative quality to it. I don't know if that's quite the answer to your question. I can't believe it.
This implies the second question, that is the question of control, because in one way or the other, we need to control the environment in order to survive. So there must be some kind of attempt to keep a stable condition that is called homeostasis, an homeostatic condition. But what's the difference between the control in the model of science on the model of dominion over nature and the cybernetic control? How would you define a cybernetic control? Definition of control by cybernetics.
Yes, good question. I actually find myself thinking about that today. I'm kind of changed, found myself understanding control in a bit of a different way from the way I used to understand it. Control in cybernetics probably has several possible different meanings, depending which variety of cybernetics you're interested in. So early cybernetics, the kind of Norbert Wiener variety, took as its model a servo mechanism, the domestic thermostat or something like that. Negative feedback was the central concept, which is a kind of, I don't know how to put it, kind of disciplinary image of control. The thermostat is trying to keep something constant. It's trying to stop things happening. And there's a whole line of critique of cybernetics is probably we all know as being, a science of control in this bad sense, and something very close connection between cybernetics and police functions, right? So that's one sense of control, which is worth worrying about. My answer, the kind of cybernetics that interests me, exhibits a different sense of what control is. So the historical line of development I traced out in my book, The Cybernetic Brain, took as its basic model not the servo mechanism, not a thermostat, but Ross Ashby's homeostat. And as I guess most of us know, the homeostat was a kind of active, exploratory kind of gadget that would emit and receive signals. If its currents went out of whack, it would randomly reconfigure its internal circuitry. And it would carry on this kind of back and forth interaction with its environment, which was modeled by Moore homeostat. And it kind of, again, as a kind of performative dance of agency. I'm a homeostat, I emit some signal, some other signal comes back, I react to that and emit a new one. So the homeostat was a beautiful model of what I call the dance of agency, and exhibits a different kind of sense of control from Wiener and the servo mechanism. What's going on with a bunch of homeostats as a kind of ontological model of how the world is better described as what Gordon Pass called a conversation, an open-ended, productive back and forth in which all of the elements are kind of influencing one another without any of them, running the show like a thermostat might do. The interesting thing that I'd never thought about till this afternoon, I never thought about it this way, is that Ashby would experiment with 4 homeostats. That was his basic setup, all interconnected with one another, and they click through different states until they finally reached a kind of equilibrium with one another, and the internal transformations stopped. And the interesting thing is this was a dynamic equilibrium. Each homeostat would become a servo mechanism for the others. So it's not that all the actions stopped, but when one homeostat did something, the others would kind of do some balancing action. And it was as if the homeostats kind of were tuned into one another. Each homeostat, in effect, got what it wanted, which was to control the flow of currents through it. But it did it by, configuring itself in relation to all the other homeostats in a kind of dynamic fashion. And I suppose that's an image of, that's the cybernetic image of control that comes out of thinking about homeostat. Instead of just open-endedly exploring the space when they're in equilibrium, what the homeostats are doing is what I call a choreography of agency. When this one goes that way, the other one goes the other way. That's a different image of control.
Mm-hmm. So the servo mechanism, the flyball valve is a step that needs to that was actually developed by the by Ashby homeostat, in the sense that the servo mechanism is just a dance between two agents, that is a steam engine and the valve. In the homeostat, we have a plurality of agents that limit one another and find this homeostatic condition passing through chaos. Maybe this is the difference between a servo mechanism and Ashby's homeostat. That is, the first is still deterministic. That is, the valve is activated by the quantity of steam. Instead, in the homeostat, we have some kind of disorder entering the game and finding within itself this homeostatic condition. So my next question would be, does a real cybernetic system, a cybernetic method of analyzing things or to deal with things imply the presence of a plurality of agents? That is, the more the agents, the easier it is to find a homeostatic condition?
No, it's actually the opposite. Ashby experimented with, different combinations of homeostats, and he also did little calculation. So if you had two homeostats randomly reconfiguring each other until they reached equilibrium, with the machines that Ashby built, that might take half a second, right? If you have three machines trying to find a collective equilibrium, then it's 5 seconds. If you have four machines, it's a minute. And the point is that as the number of homeostats trying to find equilibrium increases, you very quickly arrive at astronomical numbers for the length of time the system finds equilibrium. And this, in a way, points to a kind of political problem.
Mm-hmm.
That the question of something like collective decision making, radical democracy. In the 1960s, there were all sorts of experiments of trying to have completely open-endedly democratic organizations, universities and things like that. The anti-university, there was one in London. And the problem with that was that nobody could ever decide on anything. Meetings would last for hours and hours, and the decisions would be made by the last person who was still awake. And this was a problem they ran into in the Occupy movement as well. The problem of too much variety. And this is where Stafford Beer's work comes in, that Beer's viable system model and integration were ways of trying to limit the variety of political systems without creating hierarchies and asymmetry.
Mm-hmm. This is absolutely important, because variety is as necessary as an obstacle, might be also an obstacle if it is too much variety. This is very interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry. I don't know if we have questions or if we go on with our pre-established questions. Okay, just you tell me if you want to have to discuss this. Given that you raised an important problem, how to apply your idea of ontological theory, the dance of agencies politically? That is, can you find an example of how to work, to act with the world and not on the world, in a way that this search for equilibrium does not become, as you said before, a game of police? How can we make a cybernetic example of mutual control instead of a kind of model of police control?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, as I said, I've been thinking about the environment lately. I mean, should I give you an example of some kind of environmental project?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, I mean, I suppose my favorite one has to do with the Colorado River. In 1963, I think, a big dam was built on the Colorado River called the Glen Canyon Dam to generate hydroelectric power. It's one of the projects of enframing nature, mastering the river, just like Heidegger said, commanding this river to be a source of electricity. And that worked very well. But as usual, it had a dark side. And the dark side was that the ecosystem of the Colorado River below the Glen Canyon Dam degraded. Sandbanks disappeared, native species were threatened with extinction, invasive species moved in, and things like that. And then the stretch of the Colorado is the one that goes through the middle of the Grand Canyon, so a lot of people cared about that. The developments that interest me started in 1983 when there was a kind of accidental big flood was allowed to pass through the Glen Canyon Dam, which was overflowing, too much water in it. This accidental flood was allowed to travel down the Colorado River. And it turned out that this went some way towards reviving and restoring the ecosystem below the dam. The sandbanks were rebuilt, some species returned, others were driven out, kind of temporarily. And as time passed, again, the system became kind of degraded. But this led to what was called the adaptive management program on the Colorado, which has been running ever since and is still running. And that is my example of acting with the world. So the adaptive management program consists in staging artificial floods, letting enormous quantities of water kind of pulse through the Glen Canyon Dam once or twice a year, and monitoring the kind of restoration work that happens downstream, and feeding that information back to the parameters of the next artificial flow, and seeing how that restores the downstream ecosystem. So for me, this is a beautiful example of acting with nature instead of imposing a kind of one-off solution on it. The AMP is trying to find out what nature wants to do and act with it. It's a beautiful cybernetic feedback loop between the actions of the engineers, the actions of the river, the actions of the ecosystem. It's a dance of agency. It's a very interesting kind of decentered process. It's not controlled by the river or by the engineer. And it's ended up, I mean, this is interesting, the dance has become regularized as what I call a choreography of agency, kind of scripted synchronization of the moves of the dam controllers, the Colorado River, and another river, the Paria River, that joins the Colorado below the dam. So the trick, it turns out, in kind of maintaining the restoration of the downstream ecosystem is to time these artificial floods through the Glen Canyon Dam to occasions when this other river, the Paria River, is itself flooding and carrying a lot of sediment into the Colorado, which then gets redistributed by the water coming down from the Glen Canyon Dam and stabilizes the downstream ecosystem. So the actions of the engineers and the rivers are kind of locked together and synchronized in this kind of choreography, which interests me a lot. I mean, it's the same thing as I was just talking about with several homeostats becoming locked together in equilibrium. Mm-hmm. But now on a kind of the big scale of civil engineering.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. So this decentered process, as you call it, how can it be implemented politically? If we should imagine a politics that deals with this decentered control or diffused control, what kind of politics does this recall? Because we are used to think of politics or politicians as having a vision of the future, vision of what to do next. But what's the model of politician that you imagine? Because having a vision appears to be too deterministic in the 21st century.
Right, a vision. I mean, if there are...
this example shows that politically speaking, we can act only on the next immediate need in a total contingency without having any guide or guidelines to the future. So it is as fascinating as problematic. What do you think about what you call black box ontology? Can we imagine a black box politics?
Yeah, I mean, my way of, well, I mean, I think about politics from two angles. I mean, one angle is that I'm interested in a kind of practical politics or a politics of practices. But what I'm trying to identify in cybernetics and recommend in my work is a kind of different paradigm of actually acting in the world, right? Kind of ground level politics, of acting in a different way from our usual habitual dominant stance in the world. I think that in itself is actually more interestingly political than having, a kind of conventional political program. If we all acted in a different way, the world would be a very different place, which is, the project of politics, probably, to make the world better. And I've been, trying to explain in my work the sense in which these cybernetic ways of going on are desirable, recommendable. Another thing to say about that is that along with these kind of cybernetic practices in the world, worldly practices, goes the kind of ontology that I mentioned earlier on. This ontology of open-ended, unpredictable, decentered becoming. I think, understanding that ontology and seeing these kind of practical projects I try to map out in my work, they're kind of mutually illuminating. So the more the kind of cybernetic projects go, the more people would understand that the world actually is a place of open-ended, decentered becoming. in contrast with, our usual scientific modern worldview that the world is knowable, controllable, and we are its master. So I think, the kind of ontological politics, and politics of ontology here, that if people understood the world differently, they would act differently. And that, I suppose, eventually tends to get to the answer to your question, Brunella. If you want a vision of the future, the vision of the future should be endless vistas of possible becoming, which are there to be explored, which, to remember how old I am, is what the future used to look like in the 1960s, for example, when we had countercultural politics. People were optimistic about the future because it was endlessly explorable in all sorts of ways. So this conjures up a kind of optimistic politics, which is very different from the appalling gloom that we're all living through at the moment, I think.
Do you think that today a counterculture would be impossible?
I think it exists. I think it's all over the place. I wouldn't mind being part of it. And, probably we all would. I mean, there are traces of the old counterculture to be found everywhere. You just look on the internet. I wrote a lot about the 60s, especially in connection with cybernetics, with all the weird and wonderful things that went on in those days. And they're all, scattered around the margins of the internet. This is the problem. This is the problem that cybernetics has had since the 1950s. That it's both of these things, the counterculture and cybernetics, have lost their center. The Macy conferences were the center of cybernetics, the Namur meetings in Europe. And, the counterculture was once quite close to being the center of, culture. But now these things have disintegrated. So, my desperate quasi-political hope is to start putting the pieces back together. So, in my cybernetic brain book, I tried to put, psychiatry, robotics, brain science, management, the arts, architecture, spirituality all together and say, look, here's this big paradigm. It's worth paying attention to. And now with this book, Acting with the World, right? I've tried to shovel in some more ingredients. Here are ways of doing, civil engineering. This is how you would control wildfires if you were, at the other end connected to the 1960s counterculture. And they're all productive ways of going on. So, yeah, sure, that's the fantasy. And the counter fantasy is, Donald Trump, isn't it? I wouldn't bet on me or you. But, you can have these fantasies, right?
This goes to the next question, that is, your view is anti-representational, of course. This is why we cannot count on a representation of the world, exactly because the world is not a stable object itself. What to do with the existing representations that we have, political, scientific representation. We do have representations of science, of parties, left or right parties. What can we do? Should we get rid of these representations of science, politics, parties? Or in other terms, do you imagine a science that is not representational, that does not use or claim to represent the world, and that is totally experimental, exploratory? Is it possible to imagine it, this transition or transformation?
No, I don't think it is possible. I mean, it'd be nice to say, yes, let's get rid of representation. That's a nice, challenging thing to say. For me, that was never the project. The project was to put representation in its place, to cut it down to size. When I started, working in science studies, history of science, history and philosophy of science was all about scientific representations, as if all there was in the world was scientific theory, and the job of the philosopher was to worship, the great theories, basically of physics.
Theories.
So representation was on this pedestal. It didn't, I remember the quote from Karl Popper about experiment being trivial. The theorist says to the experimenter, go away and find out what this number is, and the experimenter finds out what the number, but really all the action is in theory. Mm-hmm. And I mean, like, a few other people back in the old days of STS, I was interested in looking what scientists actually do, right? And this is what dragged me into the kind of materiality of science, of fiddling around in the laboratory, the mangle of practice, the dance of agency, emergence, decentering. And the trick then is to understand representation as somehow part of these dances of agency that constitute scientific research as well as everything else, as far as I'm concerned. And representations are being at stake and continually transformed in material practice. They don't run the show, they're in the plane of practice. That's the sensible argument.
So it's more an image we have of science. Actually, science has always been more experimental and tentative than we think. It makes me think of Thomas Kuhn making this distinction between science as it is presented in books and documents and authority, and science as it is actually practicing the mangle. How can we say that actually scientists are in the mangle?
Yes. What do you think? Yes, we should say that. And then, it's all horribly confused by discussions of realism. So, we're brought up, we teach our children to make this immediate identification between, representations, articulated knowledge, and how the world is. Right? So knowledge seems like something very special because it's anchored to something unique over here, which is the material world. Say, the world is made out of quarks. And philosophers then jack this up as being a correspondence theory of truth. How can we be sure that our knowledge corresponds to how the world is? Which I finally decided was just a fake problematic. I mean, there's absolutely no way of going behind the scenes and saying, yes, this bit of knowledge corresponds to that bit of the world. But what you can see is that, this bit of knowledge is engaged with these kind of practices in a totally non-trivial way. So scientific knowledge is constructed. My first book was called Constructing Quarks. It is relative to where scientists are starting from. But that doesn't mean it's trivial. It's built on all these alignments between knowledge, material performances, social relations. So we really need a different understanding of what scientific representations are doing.
The knowledge loses its privilege of being the origin of action. Makes me think of Marx. Praxis comes first, and then knowledge follows.
Yes, my vote is for Marx.
Okay, last question. given that humans are hyperactive in this world, thinking of themselves as the only agents and not being actually engaged in any mangle or dance, what do you think, how can humans start doing less? Maybe the equivalent of negative feedback.
Yeah, it depends what you mean by doing less, really. But I always remember this quote, Aldous Huxley in The Doors of Perception quotes this French philosopher, I think it was Laplace, who says, the sum total of human happiness would be much increased if only men would sit quietly in their rooms.
Yeah.
You know, we'd all be much better off if people did less, right? It's these people who have to do things, the politicians, you know, conventional politicians, who have to rush around doing things, right? Decreasing, so very obviously, the sum total of human happiness, right? None of us would run around invading Ukraine or bombing the Gaza Strip, would we? Right? It would never occur to us.
Rearming Europe.
You know, you have these people whose job it is to rush around doing something, and they're the problem, in my opinion. All right, that's one thing to say. You can take it or leave it. The other question of doing less is doing less of what? I mean, I'm kind of interested in encouraging people to do less of what I'm now calling acting on the world, less enframing, less of these mega projects of domination. Let's stop drilling for oil 2 miles beneath the surface of the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, I'm thinking of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. You know, part of the impetus behind this new book is that, you know, I mean, it's okay to try and, you know, adjust the world to suit ourselves to some extent, but we've gone mad, right? I mean, and we're getting madder all the time. These projects get bigger and bigger now, right? And the you know, the dark side of the existing projects is the Anthropocene and global warming and things like that. And the answer to that is a different kind of mega project of enframing. We'll cover half the surface of the planet in solar panels and windmills, as if, you know, that's going to be perfectly harmless. They'll just pour out all the electricity we need and we'll never have to worry about anything. It's that kind of, these projects of enframing that we need to do less. And what we need to learn is how to act with the world in different practical projects. So, you know, I mean, in the book, I had this weakness for kind of non-Western philosophy. I talk about trying to tilt the balance of yin and yang. If yang is mastery, you know, the pendulum has gone far too far in that direction. And trying to get clear on this cybernetic paradigm of ways to act with the world is trying to push the pendulum back in the yin direction.
You think it will happen anyway, or humans need to change for that slow down to occur? Is it a kind of inevitable destiny, or do you think that must be implemented? This
I mean, you know, I mean, I think the standpoint of Chinese philosophy is that this pendulum swings back and forth whether we like it or not. Right? But we can, doesn't mean we have to stand idly by. We can try and give it a push in one direction or another. And, you know, yes, of course, you know, swinging over into the yin direction would involve people changing drastically. You know, and You know, I think the whole project of capitalism depends upon selling people a kind of modern ontology and all the practices that go with that, right? You know, it's not just Cartesian philosophy. It's the basis of techno-scientific capitalism, and a certain understanding of what people are goes with that, you know. Am I a productive unit, or am I, you know, maybe something a bit more interesting? Which, of course, takes us back to the counterculture. Radically different images of what people are, what we're capable of, what we need. Which was, of course, the problem with the counterculture. That's why it had to be still in the process of being blotted out. So yes, the pendulum will swing, and it will involve people changing. How many of us are going to be left? You know, that's another question.
Okay, thank you very much. So you've raised so many questions to be elaborated further. So now we can open the floor to the other participants' questions. You're intimidating, Andrew.
I'm intimidated. I feel as though I've been examined. Thinking all the answers to these questions.
Roberto Carradori, he has a question. Let me see if he writes it down in the chat. Roberto, regarding the current revival, can we hypothesize that it is linked to a certain perception of change as unregulated? If we consider the history of cybernetics, it emerged during a period of extreme uncertainty in the 40s, the first cybernetics, as a reaction to the crisis of a scientific and political framework acting as a handbrake, or rather, to think about spaces of control and, above all, the question of responsibility in the 40s. The very turning point of cybernetics, Margaret Mead, etc., in the late 60s, could be understood as a reaction to the effects of the marriage between AI and the military industry of industrial complex. Revisiting the theater metaphor, so he wants you to elaborate on the ontological theater. My question is if this were the case, could cybernetics be understood as a latent resource of the scientific community, as a kind of hidden resource, and societies, one that under certain conditions enters the stage and under other conditions exits the stage? It's a very long question. In this sense, precisely because of its lack of full institutionalization, cybernetics can still re-enter the stage, exactly because it has never been institutionalized. Today, in reaction to the new AI trend and rise from the ashes, like the phoenix, borrowing Paul Pangaro's metaphor, what do you think? Thank you very much. It's a long question. I don't know, just...
Could you repeat the question?
It's a very long question. Question...
It was a joke. It was a joke.
Let's make it... I'll try to make it shorter.
No, I understand it. I was just making a joke about it being so long.
Okay. Sorry.
You know, I mean, I think I probably agree with the spirit of that question. There was so much in it. I mean, I don't know about the 1940s. You know, we know that Wiener's cybernetics was born in his work on an anti-aircraft predictor in World War II. You know, that kind of cybernetics, I guess. Early cybernetics fitted in well with, you know, military enterprise, we could say that. the kind of cybernetics that interest me, which is built on the model of the homeostat, what I call British cybernetics. It's not just British cybernetics, but the heyday of that was, as I probably said 5 minutes ago, in the 1960s, because of, some very obvious resonances between cybernetics and the overall culture, or the overall counterculture. So cybernetics flourishes when the overall culture takes on a certain quality of open-ended experimentalism, we could say. And then, as that kind of experimental moment passes away, so does cybernetics. And I can remember thinking in 1973, which was the oil crisis, the fun's over. That's it for the counterculture. And it was it for cybernetics too. So in the sense of the question, I think, cybernetics remains a resource, because these influences between, science and society go both ways. Cybernetics is a resource for trying to act on society and change it in a broader sense. It's just that it's scattered. There are bits of it everywhere, but none of them individually have much power or influence. And then we should think about second order cybernetics. What's that a reaction to? And maybe I don't have to keep talking. Maybe we should ask Paul Pangaro. Somebody else can speak here.
Paul has been involved with this phoenix from the ashes.
Let's say that again.
Maybe Paul has some comment.
Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks, Andy, for all of your comments, and the questions are wonderful too. My idea was not unlike everyone else's idea who's ever said that cybernetics can come back. Andy says this very eloquently in Cybernetic Brain, and proposes that education systems could take it up. And in your new book, Andy, Acting with the World, you also suggest it can be reframing away from end-framing. Did you see what I did there? Instead of being stuck. I don't have more illumination on this idea that maybe it can re-enter the stage. It seems to be re-entering the stage. I hope so. I'm investing a great deal in that possibility here at Carnegie Mellon and creating a laboratory and so on, stories for another time. But my real question is, how do we change the thinking that still resists everything Andy just said? We still live in a post-enlightenment society, or not even post, which wants to know things and to act on knowledge instead of to dance and to see how the dance may emerge with agencies on both sides. And also choreography, which is a new phrase of Andy's, which I quite like. The choreography of agency is quite brilliant. So I find the resistance is to letting go into a world in which experiment and dance is the first action. Even Heinz von Forster famously said, if you wish to see, learn how to act, which is another way of saying, if you want to learn, behave in the world and then see what comes back. And that's perhaps the foundation of Andy's book, or a way of thinking about it. So my concern, and the thing I don't have an answer to, but which I struggle with all the time, is how do you change the way people think and want to know as the foundation of action, instead of dancing and then learning from the dance?
And of course, like that,
We don't have
both of my books end with the idea that we need to teach children differently. Education, I suppose, will be a kind of foundational way of trying to move the state of culture. So instead of giving people positive knowledge and telling them this is the truth. Yeah. And train students to realize that we live in a world of so-called wicked problems that don't have finite and framing scientific solution, but they still need to be wrestled with. And, you can give children practical experiences of these kinds of things. You could also tell them about, the sciences of, teach them straight about cybernetics and complexity theory and stuff like that. Show them cybernetic artworks. It is quite possible. And, people who work in education are interested in kind of new ways of teaching children that aren't, just kind of rote learning. So, yeah, I suppose if I was trying to be both serious and optimistic, then the whole educational system would be where to look.
Roberto, you have any comment about this answer? I don't know. I can't see you. Roberto's writing. While he writes, I'm thinking if this resource remains latent, it should come to the surface. It couldn't be brought to consciousness, to the awareness. Otherwise, if it remains a latent resource, it remains marginalized. This is the problem, I think. Maybe in politics it's more difficult to consider it as a likely alternative. Maybe in education is it easier to implement it as in a way that it to bring it to the surface, to become a method of thinking, not of thinking, a method of acting. What do you think? Is it education or politics more likely to undergo a transition towards cybernetic thinking?
Well, I suppose my money would be on education. Start at the beginning. I think most of the education that people get all the way through universities and PhD teaches them to understand the world in a modern way as a knowable place, and that science is generating the truth which kind of corresponds with how the world is. So, for the first 20 or 30 years of their lives, we teach people to, without question, think of the world as having a certain kind of configuration. So, it wouldn't be surprising if that 30 years of education spills over into their understanding of politics.
Yes.
So, just to give people, some resources for thinking otherwise about how the world is. We don't have to stop teaching children, physics and chemistry. I mean, I really enjoyed them when I was a child. But also provide them with some resources for thinking about the world differently and examples of how you would act. And just remind them that the problems that they're going to face at every scale in their lives aren't going to be like, calculate the frequency of oscillation of a pendulum, that even I can remember how to do. They're going to be these wicked problems that they're going to have to feel their way through. So I think we could equip, children as they're growing up in the educational system with resources for thinking differently and multiplying this other cybernetic paradigm that I keep going on about. I don't know if anybody else in this group has got any inspiration about.
Okay, any other question?
What we should do?
Paolo Renati, I'm sure he has a question.
Does he? Doesn't look like he.
I don't have. I don't know if I have a question, but for sure I resonate with what you are saying. Maybe a comment about the fact that sometimes the problems of representation, I think, affects also our thinking to the solutions, even at a level previous than the one that we can think of. Because, for instance, if we make a very simple example, in the sense that, okay, we can ask ourselves if education, let's say education and policy. Okay, does policy affect education? Does education affect policy? This is a way to set the question that presume that education and policy are two things, but maybe they are not. And so just a little hints, in the sense that the problem sometimes, I think, is even there to melt the fake boundaries that we have in our linguistic representation of the world, that I'm aware of, about the fact that we need to create a certain confinements, because we need to speak of entities, of objects that are finite, have a finiteness. But this action is already a problem, in the sense that I think that the cybernetics pushed at the extreme is maybe a liquefaction of any, maybe sometimes any, a transcendence of also the categories by which we conceive the so-called parts of the world. Sorry, maybe I'm trivial. Maybe I'm saying something stupid, but just a hint.
That sounds absolutely right to me. Politics and education really are entangled with one another. I mean, the previous Conservative government in Britain insisted on rewriting parts of the curriculum so that the history of England would be understood in a certain way. And your later remark, I mean, this kind of ontology of feedback loops, which are transforming the elements that are taking part in them. Yeah, liquefaction is a nice metaphor. It's mixing them up, right? Getting rid of the purity of them.
In the sense that I'm concerned with the problem of science, and I think that in science, this is the crucial root of the problem, in the sense that when we postulate the existence of a charge, electrical charge, or for instance, let's think about observables, we postulated the existence of mass, of time, of space, of electrical charge and spin, as they were categories, entities, properties that exist independently on each other. I know that is stupid, maybe what I'm saying, but this is like Husserl, sort of a pre-categorial attitude by which we set the problem. And so this is not the same problem that I think in also ecodynamics. We study, okay, let's see how these living species interact, the feedback, the loops. Actually, we could ask ourselves, where does a lion starts and ends? In the sense that, this is the fakeness of the entity in itself, and maybe we could shift and reverse the problem, ontologically speaking, in the sense that ontology is not made of, reality is not a collection of entities that are in relation between among them, but the contrary, is a self-relational process that let entity emerge, but just like representations, just like approximation. Here, to me, is the mistake of Plato, in the sense that Plato talked about the identity as a principle that exists in sense, the cube, the tetrahedron, the perfect idea. Actually, the perfection, like Spinoza, is in the relational of the allness of reality, from which we need to reduce and create artifactly entities just to make a computation. In Macy conferences, QB says a very smart sentence to me, that is, we are constantly in the attempt to reduce the problem to the mathematical terms in order that we can handle it. But we have already created other problems that we do not see anymore once we have done that. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what I was calling the dark side. I mean, I think I agree entirely with what you just said, but to kind of rephrase it a bit, Gregory Bateson had this kind of ontological image of the world as, made up of an indefinite number of, entities or somethings, right? All connected endlessly to one another. One of his points was that, trying to act on that kind of a system, his metaphor, it was like trying to reverse a truck with two trailers. You can't control it. But the interesting thing is, of course, that we can kind of partially control. We can rip little bits out and say, oh yeah, this is correlated with that. And the example in environmentalism, from the 60s would be DDT, right? DDT really kills insects. But at the same time, and this is what I meant by the dark side, there are all these other things echoing around this infinite net, which include, all the birds dying, right? Nobody wanted the birds to die. It's just a spin-off of crystallizing this whole thing in terms of trying cause and effect and finite entity. I believe that's exactly what you were saying, but in a different image.
Yes.
Yeah.
This kind of continuism and not the actual existence of objects or these continuous entities, which are actually systems. I can see only some of you. Maybe Marco Ceranic has a question. Nicola, I don't know why I can't see you. Alessandro, any comment?
Well, I'm still processing all that is being said. I'm very much on the Spinozian side, so I follow with enthusiasm this idea of the substance and of representation as an emergence of or an approximation. Also, I like the idea. I was thinking in that sense that perhaps we could distinguish between theory and representation, because perhaps not all theories need to be forms of situated representation of a unique direction of reading of the world. Perhaps there's a way, as in the case of Spinoza, or what is being said during this talk, to produce a theory that is diffuse and multidimensional enough not to confine itself into what we could call a representation. And from my point of view, I think it has to do also a lot with not only with theory but also with poetry, because contrary to the cliche, as Brunella knows, I think of poetry as something that is not dependent from a situated subject. It's not the emanation of an isolated subject, but rather a stratification of different points of view that respond to the environment from this multiplicity, and only there can exist a text that is not the product of a single representation precisely. So perhaps language also, in its different ways of looking at it or practicing it, should also enter the equation. But these are just, open reflections that, and I'm still, as I said, I'm still kind of processing. So I probably need a little more time to. But I'm very glad to listen to this talk, because I feel like there's a community thinking in a direction that I think is very important, and perhaps a little bit forgotten today in this perhaps precisely in this position of agency. Also, in that sense, perhaps the last thing I could say is that poetry or perhaps artistic practice as a whole could be intended as not as a form of precisely as a form of action, of doing things, but rather of receiving things and then doing something out of them, but not in the way, not in the sense of an authority, but rather it was mentioned, the notion of poiesis was mentioned at the beginning by Andrew, but rather as a form of precisely responding to this multiplicity without wanting to fix and position oneself, but rather as a way of stratifying language or other kinds of media into the work of art. So yeah, of course, I'm thinking from my perspective. That's it.
Yeah. Sounds good. I don't know what else to say to that. I mean, language has many functions. I mean, in the end, the point of theory or representation for me would be to conjure up a vision of the kind of non-linguistic world. And there must be many ways of doing that. Certainly poetry, but I don't know what else to say.
I always say that poetry is a paradox because it is a language, but it always deals with a non-verbal sphere of reality, precisely because it tends to reorganize or redefine language in such a way that is completely different from precisely its representational or communicative or transitive functions. So it is really the language of the environment in a way. It is really the language of multiple simultaneous points of view from my perspective. So yes, I think it's language that is not language in the sense in which we intend it every day, perhaps. Yeah.
Right. No, that's very nice.
Can we define a cybernetic language? Maybe this question is more for Paul Pangaro. Can we consider language as dependent on conversation and not just the origin of conversation? Meaning by conversation what Alessandro maybe meant by a decentered way to consider the expression of thinking or speaking.
I'm sorry, the expression of the last thing you said.
How can we redefine language? Because Alessandro's issue is isn't language originally poetic if it doesn't have a structure, because we know language as a structure. But language is much more than a structure, and poetry is exactly the evidence of it. Concerning conversation, could we say that conversation, by definition, by its essence, destroys the idea of linguistic structure? If a structure is meant as something that is like the skeleton of anything that we say, it depends on that structure, but actually it's not true.
I have the feeling that the question is evolving as it's been retold. I can put it back, if you don't mind, into the idea, maybe this is why you're calling on me, that design today must be conversation. And designing for conversation is the highest possible goal. My colleague Hugh Doberly and I have written about this. Systems are so complicated that it requires multiple people, humans, to be engaged. If you're engaging in systems, you have to engage in cybernetics because that's the science of purpose, and we look at systems as if they have purpose, but of course it is our purpose that we imbue into them, and then we need language in which to express how we think best to frame the purpose of the systems that we're examining. So we rely on language. We give it meaning in the consensual coordination that we have as we make meaning because we point to real objects and we put the ideas together. And as Pask would argue, the nervous system is here to make it coherent and to identify ambiguity and contradiction such that we can converge on a shared meaning, such that we can converge on shared action. And it's conversation which has to be in the center of that. So in the modern age, conversation is design, or as we prefer to say, we have to design conversations for action. And it's this twin of cybernetics and design that I think gives us structure, at least in one sense, markers, distinctions that are clear enough to act with. I'm not sure I'm addressing the question as it was offered by Alessandro, but without conversation, we can't have agreement, and without agreement, we can't act in coordination, and without that, we can't do design, period. Because design in the modern age is not craft, making a fork and offering it to the village all by myself, but rather it's this coordinated system of systems of making things and proposing things and seeing what happens. But I hope that touches on where we are.
No, absolutely. The idea of sharing implies that action does not depend on a subject-object relationship, a privileged relationship with an object, but with other subjects, which are in their turn partially defined.
Yes, yes. The meaning arises as a consequence of the social collective interaction. And that's what's important. You know, what this is made out of doesn't matter. What we think of it matters.
I don't think that's true.
No? Go on. Is that, maybe I spoke too broadly, but go ahead.
Well, I mean, you know, I was trying to talk about interactions with the material world, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think, you know, that is a cup is just a matter of social agreement. And, you know, who cares about cups? But actually, you know, it's a product of a lot of interactions, you know, through the history of your life. And so, yeah, I'm against this idea that conversations are just language. Let's say that, right? I mean,
I accept the correction. Thank you for calling me out. I overgeneralized. I shouldn't have said it doesn't matter. But the consequence of the materiality, of course, is present. But we can distort that or take advantage of a resonance with the materiality as much as we wish, right? We can pretend that it has mystical qualities, or we can realize that it's a constraint. The materiality of it is a constraint. Yes. No, I overgeneralized. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to argue with you, especially, but you know, saying materiality is a constraint is a crime against materiality.
Oh, wonderful!
We live in a world that, you know, is vibrant and doing things all the time that we have to take account of. Right? I mean, it's raining outside this window.
Yeah.
I better take account of that when I go outside. I mean, you know,
Isn't taking
it's just a
account though saying it's a
constraint. I mean,
constraint?
you know, there's a switch there. I can put the electric light on it. That's the world doing a wonderful thing, you know. To call that a constraint is to...
But I think of constraint in the sense of design as an opportunity, not as a limitation. Yeah, no, I think we agree on that, and I'm not trying to force an agreement.
I mean, you know, I've had trouble with the word constraint for a very long time, but you know, formulations like constraints are an opportunity.
Why do you have a problem with that? It's just a framing.
Yeah. It's like saying left is just right or something, isn't it? You know. Constraint is something that gets in the way, and an opportunity is something that invites you. Sorry, this isn't supposed to be a discussion of the English language.
I'm having a good time.
Yeah.
I don't mind it at all. The question is, do we disagree a lot, or do we actually just have trouble with the words? It's all semantics, someone once was accused of saying. It's a convenience to say that a constraint is an opportunity, but it's also a way of not being pushed back by it. It's certainly helpful to say to a student that that thing that you're worried about is perhaps immutable, or perhaps something that you can place differently, frame differently, and therefore, as I think you were just suggesting, invent something new as a result of tripping on it.
Yes. I mean, you really shouldn't go on about this, but you know, constraint is an image of a kind of obstacle, maybe a soft obstacle, which can be overcome. Whereas if you think of the world as being a lively place that can perform in all sorts of different ways, then you're trying to end up building a bubble chamber, like one of my case studies.
Yes.
You know, you're confronted with, you know, this wonderful, you know, possibly frustrating liveliness of the world, not knowing what it's going to be able to do next. You know, it's just, you know, I think we need a richer word than constraint. But
it's very beautiful, and I embrace it, and I'm happy to be re-educated in this moment to think about the world more alive. I am pulling out old definition and old ways of thinking about this. Wonderful.
Yes, well, if I understand you well, what's the relationship between design and constraints? Is a design always dealing with constraints, if I understand your mutual discussion? Design, to what extent can we design what we want? And there's always a constraint with which that is actually the opportunity through which we make any design. To what extent is a design designable? Well, I mean, I'm asking too many questions to Paul, because this will be the next this will be his seminar. I don't want to spoil his seminar, but you know, what is going back to Andrew, what is the relationship between having an interactive project with nature and dealing with constraints? Actually, the idea of constraints sounds perfectly cybernetic.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's the first paper I wrote, called The Mangle of Practice, had a long footnote in it about the difference between resistance and constraint. And I said, a constraint to me sounds like something that's always there and you might bump into it. I was reading a bit of popular history that had the image of an invisible rubber cage. Some historian was saying, you know, in the 16th century, people lived in an invisible rubber cage, meaning they were constrained in their thinking. the concept that I was talking about a lot in kind of, what we could call design, trying to invent new scientific instruments. I was talking about resistance. Resistance is something has gone wrong here and now. It's something which has just emerged on a particular trajectory. That's the way I understand practice and design. I would say there are no such things as constraints in terms of things that abide, that you're destined to bump into. I think it's even a problem to believe that there are things like that. I mean, I have examples of people doing things in the laboratory that was said to be impossible. It was once said to be impossible to build a dirty bubble chamber, which is one that has a metal to glass junction. Everybody said that's impossible. That's a constraint. And I think it was Louis Alvarez or one of his assistants who, I know, I'll go and build one, right? And it turned out he could build it, right? It wasn't a constraint. This is my answer to constraint talk.
In fact, actually, we have a comment by Matteo Tonoli who says art is allowed to remove constraints. This is why we have something called art. That goes back also to what Alessandro was saying. Art or poetry, aren't they the chances to remove constraints? See Fontana Burri, but also cubism, etc. Yeah. So, and this is also reinforced by Paolo. Okay, could we say that these constraints are an occasion to remove them? Isn't that a paradox or not? What do you think? These are an example, art or poetry, are they examples of these seemingly impossible projects that become possible?
Yes, yes, so this is a certain kind of image of art as the avant-garde, going where no man has gone before. And of course, yes, that's one function of art, right? And again, it shows you in a different realm that there are no such things as constraints. There are a lot of problems, but I personally wouldn't call them constraints.
What is interesting with art and poetry is that there were constraints in terms of frames or structures that were much more rigid until the 19th century. For instance, metrics or representational painting. And Fontana, who mentioned in the note, for example, he destroys the canvas, or then the free verse or prose poetry starts in the 19th century. So there is this intrinsic desire, at least in modernity, but perhaps even in the past, in artistic practice, to remove constraints, perhaps in order to explore this multiplicity we were talking about. And another thing I was thinking, listening to you, is about this conversation, the element of conversation that was brought up by Brunella, is perhaps the fact that not only conversation can also indeed go beyond language, because or at least we should reconsider language as embedded in the environment, but also that the poetic text, if going back to poetry, is already conversational in the sense that it's never the product of a single voice. It's always a stratification of different inputs and different influences, historical, environmental, subjectal, objectal, that are condensed into the text. And perhaps this could be also said by any work of art. The subjective gesture is just the tip of an iceberg of a much wider, multidimensional set of influences that give way to the work of art.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very nice.
This goes with what Andrew calls this acting with. Now, when we speak in art or poetry, we act with someone else or the world or the environment. It's never a subjective activity that starts with the subject. Okay, I think there's so much food for thought that we can, unless there are other questions. Are there any other questions or questions in the chat? Roberto Carradori says something. Roberto, a brief comment on the theme of conversation. I hope that we will develop it in Paul's seminar. If conversation also involves converting, for instance, religious conversion, it may entail a certain violence. This is interesting. Conversation and violence. The collapse of one's prior certainty. Yet every act of violence can become a moment of truth, of enlightenment about constraints and what is really happening. Perhaps cybernetics helps us understand this ambiguity, this inherent risk of conversation. In this sense, has something to do with responsibility. So conversation, overcoming of previous beliefs, which entails violence and responsibility. What do you think? Violence in conversation.
You asking me or Paul?
Well, both. I don't know what Roberto means, but.
Well, all right. I mean, yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, I think in second order cybernetics, when people talk about conversation, they mean something nice and pleasant and productive. For me, I was just thinking of conversation as a kind of metaphor for this back and forth in which everything's changing. So I don't see conversation is a dance of agency, but all dances of agency are not literally conversation. So you can have interactions with the material world, and all sorts of disasters are actually back and forths of any agency, which we could call conversations. And that generalized sense of conversation with non-humans, for example. I mean, I'm not sure that you could have the image of a moment of truth, I suppose, on the human side, realizing you've been doing everything wrong for the last 15 years, that kind of thing. But yeah, so there's this question about the niceness of conversation. I mean, maybe we should ask Paul about this.
I think the metaphor of violence for the collapse of one's prior certainties is apt. It's a metaphor. It's about something terrible in one way and wonderful in another way going on, and calling that enlightenment is also, I think, equally valid. I would claim, yes, cybernetics, a cybernetic view of conversation, does help understand that you're calling it, Roberto, an ambiguity. There's a lot going on in the collapse. There's that moment of terror when your world is rearranged, or part of your world is rearranged. I'm not sure how you get to responsibility. I might guess. I don't want to extend it for over time, but I'd be curious what you mean when you say responsibility emerges from that. The risk of the responsibility to face what has occurred. I'm not quite sure what you mean, but in general, I agree with what you're saying.
I don't know if Roberto wants to clarify.
Yeah.
Anyway, a comment on this. When Andrew, when you talk about mangle, the image, the metaphor of mangle implies some violence, because dealing with the chaotic, with some chaotic, random world of noise, etc. That limits our control. How to deal with that? Or do you have this image that includes violence? And does this image include some kind of violence, or accepting some kind of violence?
Yeah, there was a time before I had the word mangle when I used to talk about dialectics of resistance and accommodation, which has got an awful lot of syllables in it. And it's a noun, try turning it into a verb. I thought I needed another word. And the other word that came to me was mangle. And mangle was very attractive to me. It was the kind of word that philosophers of science would never use. It's such a silly word. It does have these connotations of violence. I was mangled in a traffic accident. To describe science in those terms seemed to be a good way of annoying people. And of course, the mangle is a piece of domestic equipment used by women to squeeze the water out of the washing, in English parlance, which is again, kind of a provocative word. So, I liked mangle because it had so many associations. Yes, polyvalent, one might say.
Very good. Okay, I think we can conclude. Any conclusive words by anyone, or we can say a big thank you, Andrew, for this wonderful talk, and looking forward for Paul's talk about that, continuing with this on this line. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. It was a great pleasure to listen to you. Thank you
very much for having me. Very good.
Thank you. We'll
Thank
keep
you
in touch.
so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye to everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.